I'm Kristin Etter, and this is Sidebar Immigration, a podcast about immigration law with Texas grit. No suits, no jargon, just real talk from experts in the field. We break down complex immigration issues in a way that's clear and relevant for everyone. Whether it's policy deep dives, big picture conversations, or candid interviews with advocates, we're here to make sense of it all without the legalese. If you're looking for straight answers and expert insights, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to Sidebar Immigration. In this episode, we are recapping Texas's 89th legislative session and the litigation surrounding Texas's DREAM Act, a bipartisan law that allows certain undocumented students to receive in-state tuition. So I'm joined today by Krystal Gomez, one of our managing attorneys, and I'm also so pleased to be joined by my colleague Priscilla Lugo, the policy and communications manager here at Texas ILC. And in a little bit, we'll be joined by Gaby Pacheco, who's president and CEO of the Dream.us. So I'm so pleased to have you both on. Krystal, how are you doing? Have you been able to catch your breath after the legislative session?
Yeah, a little bit. It took a bit, but I feel like back to being almost a normal human after the legislative session.
Priscilla, you helped out with a lot of the resources and educational materials.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks. I'm usually on as production, so this is a nice different take for me to be on as a speaker for the pod today. Yeah, I'm Priscilla, Policy and Communications Manager. This session felt like particularly more exhausting than previous ones have felt.
Yeah, if there is one topic that probably touched on every piece of legislation this session, what is that particular topic and how did it impact what passed this session?
Immigration was a very big deal, very big topic of conversation. It felt like in every one of the governor's emergency items for this session, there was some immigration bill that fell into it. We had the SJR1, we had education, and then there were the DREAM Act stuff, which we'll talk about later. It felt like in every one of his priority issues, somebody introduced a bill that would make sure that immigrants and migrants were especially put under the radar or attacked.
Krystal was really our expert this session. Given your background, Krystal, as an immigration lawyer, did the legislators seem to understand immigration law and some of these very kind of fundamental definitions about what it means to be lawfully present, who is undocumented, who has lawful presence? You spent hours trying to explain, creating charts, sitting down with lawmakers and staffers to really provide this very fundamental understanding of what it means to be an immigrant in Texas at various different definitions and having to really interact with both federal and state law. So kind of talk generally about how you think that played into some of these broader bills that Priscilla talked about that really touched on immigration at every level.
Yeah, I think we always knew that our state legislators don't totally understand immigration law. And maybe when we say immigration law is complex and it's hard to understand even for immigration attorneys and judges get it wrong. And I don't know if they necessarily believed us or they didn't quite understand how complex. So we kept seeing folks dip their toes into trying to create like a state level definition of who is undocumented and who is not, or as they would put it, who's an illegal alien and who is not. And they kept doing such like, they'd say, well, anybody who entered the country illegally is an illegal alien. And we'd have to go in and explain, well, actually, no, federal law allows people to adjust their status in these various situations. People who are trafficking victims, people who are victims of violence by domestic partners who are LPRs or US citizens. These folks may have entered the country illegally as part of the trafficking or something else. And now they've become permanent residents or they've become citizens, and your definition is still encompassing, citizens because you think crossing the border unlawfully or outside of a checkpoint means you're illegal, without realizing that there are all these other complexities about federal immigration law where we make sure that people have ways of adjusting their status if they've been victims, if they've been helpful to police. It's not so cut and dry. And I think that was a hard one to get across with legislators this session.
Yeah, I can't remember how many bills that you provided resources on where the definition that had been crafted in the bill's language of quote unquote illegal alien included not just lawful permanent residents, but also in many instances, US citizens.
Yes. And like big bills, big pieces of legislation, like potentially constitutional amendments to our Texas Constitution were going to include naturalized citizens as illegal aliens.
Wow.
Even having, candidly, even having like conversations with legislators directly and saying your definition includes naturalized citizens, they would tell me, well, yeah, but that's naturalized citizens. So that's not like a US citizen. They're still guests in this country, without recognizing that a naturalized citizen is a US citizen. That's just one method of becoming a US citizen. And that was really eye-opening too. They hadn't figured out that when I say naturalized citizen, that's the same thing as a US citizen. You are a US citizen. There's no special category of like lesser citizen.
Right.
It was
Yeah.
wild.
And speaking to the complexities when you're trying to impose a state immigration system within the context of a federal system, let's focus on some of the bills that did end up passing because there was a lot of bad stuff. And thankfully, most of it died. But Priscilla, I want to get your take on Senate Bill 8 and really speaking about the organizing that went when we saw this bill get filed. There was a ton of opposition across the state, not just by immigrants and immigrant activists, but law enforcement. So, kind of talk a little bit about Senate Bill 8 and let's start at the beginning. Why
The
was this bill
original.
filed? What
Yeah.
did it do? And really, what was the impact that you saw leading up to the hearings and the organizing?
Yeah, of course. So I think let's start off with explaining what SB 8 is, right? And SB 8 changed so many times throughout this legislative session. So I'm going to start talking off with what it was originally filed and so what we were originally organizing around. And we can get into the story of what ended up coming to be in that sense of what did pass. But SB 8 started off, there was two different versions of this bill. One of them would require counties with over 100,000 people to mandatorily enter into 287G agreements. Texas has 254 counties, and this would be a significant amount of our counties that would fall under this mandatory 287G agreement. And 287G agreements, for those who maybe don't know or maybe who have heard this, 287G agreements are agreements that our local county sheriff's office can get into or our local police departments can get into with ICE. And then there's three different models that folks can sign on to. There's the warrant service officer model, the jail enforcement model, and then the task force model. And they all do various different things, but by effectively signing on to a 287G agreement, you're saying that your agency, either your local police department or your local sheriff's office, is going to be enforcing immigration law to a certain extent. And so that's in a nutshell what SB 8 was. And so I think what we really saw this legislative session with this is, yes, we definitely saw like the immigrant rights advocates coming out and talking about how this is really harmful. This is going to be leading to potentially racial profiling in our communities that has already been exacerbated under Operation Lone Star along the border. And then we also saw the criminal justice advocates coming out and talking about how this was a really harmful bill because this is going to increase the jail capacity. And then we had law enforcement actually come out and be like, hey, we are pro like law and order here. We're not trying to say that this is a bad idea, but we don't have the money to do this. If you mandate us to get into 287G agreements, taxes will go up because we will need to then pay for increased bed capacity, to pay for overtime, to pay for more resources and materials that officers are going to be using in the line of enforcing this. And so we saw sheriffs and law enforcement come out either testifying in support of the bill, but really like apprehensively and being like, but we really need some money to do this. This is an unfunded mandate if you guys are just going to pass this through like this. So that was a lot of the concerns that we actually saw from local law enforcement and then also just local elected leaders coming through and being like, we don't have the money to do this. And if we do this, we're going to have to cut funding from other parts of our public safety initiatives or from other parts of our county's budget to abide by this.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the public safety aspect because it wasn't just money, right? Because you have a finite number of law enforcement officers in any community. And what 287G agreements do is it turns those public safety officers into ICE agents, and it re-designates and prioritizes their tasks on having to enforce immigration law, going after people that aren't criminals, rather than being able to do what is necessary to keep the community safe. And 287G has been around a long time. It has always been a discretionary option. And so if law enforcement wanted to do this prior to Senate Bill 8, they could, and some did. So when we talk about law enforcement not really being on board, it's not just a financial reason, but I think we've seen time and time again when you divert law enforcement away from public safety threats and you turn them into ICE agents, all of us are less safe.
Yeah, absolutely. We did some research on this. So, like you said before, counties would choose to sign on to these agreements, right? It wasn't mandated. And so at one point, Harris County, the county where Houston is in, signed on to the jail enforcement model. And within the first few months of participating in this model, Harris County spent $675,000. That's an insane amount of money. And so really thinking about what is this doing? Again, we're pulling money away from other places because we do have to pay for this, right? Our local law enforcement does have a budget, right? They don't have an infinite amount of money that's just coming in. And so we saw this in a bunch of different places too, even across the country. And the task force model, which was the model that we were mostly concerned about, in 2010, this model cost two North Carolina counties $5.3 and $4.8 million in just 1 year of operations. This is just cost. And to your point, Kristin, we have the public safety concerns with this, right? Where now people might be scared to reach out and call law enforcement about a potential crime that's happening in their neighborhood because they're worried that they're going to be profiled and that they're going to be asked about what their immigration status is and that they're going to escalate this and call ICE. And so there's a lot of really valid concerns about this at the community level and at the economic level.
I wanted to jump in and talk a little bit about the models that Priscilla was talking about, just in case some of our listeners have curiosity about what the jail enforcement model means and what the task force model means. There's 3 different models, from like least intense, least amount of work for the law enforcement agency to most intense, most amount of work. So warrant service officers, like the least intense, least amount of work, probably the least costly for the law enforcement agency. And essentially 1 or 2 people at the law enforcement agency become trained to be able to create these administrative warrants that we see ICE using to arrest people. And then also to review ICE detainers or issue ICE detainers if somebody's in the jail. So they can put in the detainer and they could transfer custody to ICE or take them directly. So that's the like least intensive version. And it's also sort of something that our jails are already doing, or at least the impact wouldn't be that different because we've got this 2017.
Right. Since 2017 in Texas, we have outlawed quote unquote sanctuary cities. So counties already have been complying and are forced to comply with ICE detainers.
Right. So the warrant service officer model came about right around then. It didn't exist prior to the first Trump administration. And it came about because of sanctuary cities. This was like the administration's attempt to have anti-sanctuary city model of 287G. So this is not something Texas has to worry about. We've outlawed sanctuary cities. This is not something that's happening here. So very little impact just to implement this warrant service officer model. Second level is the jail enforcement model that Priscilla was just talking about. And this is where you train the people at the county jail on how to interrogate people who've been arrested about their immigration status. And they're basically acting as ICE officers within the jail. And they can also hold people within the jail for ICE. So this one's a little bit more expensive because of these costs associated with detention, with training and things like that. So this one is going to be more intense. And it comes with enhanced liability concerns because there's all this litigation that's ongoing, these settlements that happen, these lawsuits that are going about the probable cause behind detainer requests. And so the landscape is constantly shifting on what kind of detainer requests are valid and legal and where and by issued by what federal government entity. And we're going to have our local law enforcement diving into this without really knowing, a whole lot. I think that the total training for this is like 2 days of training with ICE. So it's not an extensive training. And so this one's a little scarier. And then we've got the task force model, which is like the big bad one. This one costs millions of dollars, not just in implementation costs, but in litigation potential. And it has our officers out there acting as ICE agents. They could ask people for their papers on the street. This one's a lot more scary and a lot more intense for the law enforcement agency.
Yeah, and then we're asking our law enforcement agents to basically be able to make these on the spot determinations of who they believe is here unlawfully. And as you just talked about, Krystal, our lawmakers, many of whom are actually lawyers and they've been doing this for a long time, they themselves did not understand immigration law. They themselves were including in the definitions of illegal aliens, US citizens and lawful permanent residents. And we're now asking our law enforcement officers to be making these decisions in the street, on the spot, under this task force model. And what does that look like in our communities?
In the wake of all of these ICE raids that have been ramping up across the country, right? And so we've been seeing ICE and in some situations, even local law enforcement collaborating with ICE to conduct these raids. We're seeing like very valid public safety concerns about what these raids and what this means, right? It's a force multiplier for ICE. We are making our communities inherently unsafe and less prosperous. We've already been seeing the results of some of these ICE raids that communities and restaurants have had to shut down temporarily because they don't have enough workers. They were either picked up in these raids or their workers are scared to go to work because they know raids are happening. And so we're seeing our communities lose out on business because people are scared to go out in public and operate in their normal daily selves. And then we're going to be seeing the secondary consequences of crimes that are maybe going unreported and people unwilling to cooperate with law enforcement because they're worried about what this could potentially mean for them if their local law enforcement officer in front of them is also now operating as an ICE agent and can ask them about their immigration status.
I think Texans will come to regret Senate Bill 8. There is just no doubt in my mind. It's set to be implemented when I think Krystal's at December of this year. January. Okay,
Like
so
January 1st.
Yeah, January 1st, 2026. And we'll see how Texans like it. But I think at the end of the day, when people realize that their communities are less safe, that people are being harassed, that lawful permanent residents and citizens are getting swept up in these deportation raids being done now by not just federal agents, but also state law enforcement, they will come to regret it. And it's one of those things where there's going to be a lot of unfortunate tragedies that happen. And hopefully the pendulum might swing back in another session or two once people feel the repercussions.
Talk a little bit about like how it ended up passing.
Yes. I think that's
that is
really, yes, that I'm so glad you brought that up, Krystal, because yes, I think that's a really fascinating aspect of Senate Bill 8.
And it sort of comes up later, similarly with the in-state tuition situation. So SB 8, we knew heading in, there's going to be a bill called SB 8, and this bill is going to be a 287G bill, and this is the one to watch, this is the one they're going to try to pass. And it didn't get filed till later in the game. So the Senate passes their version, which is, as Priscilla was saying, left all these models open and had this grant program that would cut out big cities, saying you can just absorb the cost into your budgets. But for little cities, you can do these grant programs to implement these 287G models, which the federal government won't pay for. They're not going to pay for overtime. They're not going to pay for staffing. So Senate passes their version. It comes over to the House. Well, we've got a House member who is a sheriff, Sheriff Lauterbach, so who's also a representative. And he does do a 287G agreement, but he does the jail enforcement models. I think folks really look to him for some guidance on whether or not this bill should pass as is, or they should make any changes. And Sheriff Louderback, I think, was rightfully concerned about these task force models. Being a sheriff, he knew how expensive these were going to be. And so there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of conversations between all parties to figure out what was best policy when it came to mandating 287G agreements. And so what the House passed was limiting the grant version. So the grants, you could get a grant proposal and get money for funding, but it had to be for the warrant service officer model because there just isn't enough money. So if everyone goes out and starts doing the task force model, it's going to run these grant programs down really fast because there just isn't enough money to pay for all of this. So they said, okay, if you do first line, least expensive model, we'll reimburse you for those costs. There's this grant program. So that's what passes out of the House, which we talked about was something that it wasn't great, but we could live with because the impact to communities was not as intense as it would be with the task force model. So it goes to conference committee because the Senate refuses to concur with those changes. And what we'd heard was that the Senate agreed with the changes. The only thing they had concerns about was the reimbursement and grant program part of it. So 2 days before it's set to be voted out of the committee, Donald Trump sends a truth post saying that SB 8 needed to be passed as written, as passed out of the Senate. They needed to go back to the original version and take out that grant that would have just reimbursed for the cheaper warrant service officer model. And it was over. So as soon as that truth post came out, it was not about good policy anymore or about fiscal conservatism or any of those things. And they did. They passed out what Donald Trump wanted.
And it's really, at the end of the day, about making Texas subservient to the federal government, right? Because they wanted the most aggressive model. They want to be able to control our local law enforcement officers. And then that's what they ended up passing. So again, this is a real slap in the face to our local law enforcement officers across the state. And they will be subservient now to the federal government and will have to do whatever the federal government tells them they have to do.
Yep. And to our legislators that were really trying to have good policy and pass good policy.
There were two really bad anti-immigrant bills that passed. We've talked a lot about Senate Bill 8, but there was another one that was very concerning, Senate Bill 17. Could you briefly describe what that was and then what the impact is going to be?
So this was a ban on foreign property ownership. And what ended up passing with SB 17 was a limitation on the ability of non-US citizens, non-legal permanent residents from China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia to own land in Texas. And also a limitation on their ability to rent for a year or longer. And so the concerns here are really for our folks who are building lives. They're here on visas, specialized visas, or student visas, like doctors, for instance, who might be here with a visa and they're not a permanent resident yet. And we're trying to recruit talent that they're not going to want to be in Texas because they can't buy a house. They can't have stability for their family by signing a rental agreement for longer than a year. And so this one was not great.
Yeah, it's just going to be a situation where Texans are going to suffer because we are going to be losing those people to other states. And in terms of, and the DREAM Act has that potential to just really devastate our economy. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But before we get to that, what about the ones that did not pass? If you could highlight, for example, House Bill 1554, there was also SJR 1, but tell us a little bit about those two bills.
Yeah, so SJR 1 was a big one. The good rule of thumb is the lower the number, the more important the bill. So it's number one, SJR 1. And so it's very obviously very important to the governor. And it was introduced by Senator Huffman, who kind of controls the purse strings in the Senate. And it would have denied bail to anybody accused of a felony. So nothing has to be proven. It's an accusation. if they are an illegal alien as defined in the bill. And that part of the bill is really what killed it. So they could never come to a consensus on what illegal alien meant. We started out including naturalized citizens. We ended up only excluding DACA recipients, victims of violence, and U visas. So basically those folks would have still been illegal aliens plus people who were undocumented. And they couldn't get the requisite Democrat support for it because it's a constitutional amendment and needs 2/3 vote. And the Democrats were able to block that bill. And it came up a lot of times. They tried really hard. They named it Jocelyn's Law after the little girl that died in Houston. So it was also like an emotional and manipulative tactic, even though it had nothing to do with the case, to try to move that one along too. And so it was good work, and they couldn't get there on the illegal alien definition.
And then briefly, House Bill 1554, and then we're going to turn to the DREAM Act.
Yes, so HB 1554 would have prohibited, I think the goal was to prohibit local city governance or local municipalities from spending money on immigration defense for their residents. So San Antonio has this program, Austin, Houston. So I think they were trying to outlaw that. But because the bill wasn't drafted very well, it also would have outlawed immigration clinics in law schools. And so that one was a big deal too. And it passed out of the committee, but it died in calendars, and it took a lot of advocacy to get to that place too. It would have really impacted our ability to train new attorneys.
Well, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the DREAM Act. Gaby, I'm so happy to see you. We are so honored and pleased to welcome Gaby Pacheco. She is the president and CEO of the Dream.us, and I'm so happy that we got the chance to get to know you this session, Gaby. It's such a pleasure to have you. I want to turn it over to you to introduce yourself and your organization and tell us a little bit about your amazing work.
Great. Well, it's great to be with all of you. I think if there's anything that good came out of this session was getting to meet you all and getting to see you all in action. And it's just so incredible how you all are able to be tracking, writing memos, speaking, doing it all, and I just feel so grateful for that. And the work that we do at the Dream.us is at the intersection of what is higher education, workforce development, immigration, and advocacy. And the Dream.us is the nation's largest and leading organization in these areas. We've been around since 2013. We launched on February 4th, 2014, and we have provided thousands of scholarships, over 12,000 scholarships to Dreamers across 40 states. And our number one state is Texas because of how many students are there. We have these partnerships with institutions, and the way we're able to partner with them is that states like Texas, when they have in-state tuition, the cost of education is affordable. But even with in-state tuition rates, these students are not eligible for Pell Grants, for loans. So this is where the Dream.us comes in. And our students, every single one of them are low-income students that would be Pell eligible. But because they're not residents or citizens, they are not able to receive this. So here's where the Dream.us comes in. We provide a $33,000 scholarship. And throughout the whole entire time, we have seen these young people who are just so talented and driven be able to go to school. And majority of them that have graduated in the past, right, had DACA. So the DACA program was first introduced in 2012. But unfortunately, today's oldest DACA recipient is about 40 something. The average age is 31. The youngest DACA recipient is about 20. And so our new generation of dreamers that have been graduating, that have grown up in our country, the average age of arrival of our Texas students are 4. And they grow up going from kindergarten to 12th grade. They graduate from Texas schools, and they want to go to school and they want to go to college. And one of the reasons why this legislation was first introduced in 2001 is because there was a lot of young people that didn't have hope for being able to go to college. And we were seeing dropout rates, and we were seeing students saying, if I can't go to school, then why am I working so hard? And so the Dream.us has been kind of that beacon of hope for young people and helping them close the gap. And what we have seen is that has helped many young people be able to go in the workforce with a bachelor's degree. I know a lot of my numbers from Florida, not so much Texas, but I'm sure it's kind of equal. But we know that a college degree in Florida means about $62,000 a year versus just high school diploma. An individual will make about $32,000, $36,000 a year. So we know the potential of and the power of higher education. And so the Dream.us selfishly goes out and supports these students because we know it's going to be supporting not just them, not just their families, but our whole entire community, our country, and the states that they live in.
I'm so grateful for your work, Gaby, for your organization, and just for you. You have been such a tireless advocate. You flew to Texas, you testified, you stayed up really late with us, and you're amazing. And your organization is amazing. I'm going to turn it actually to Priscilla. I mean, this has always been a nonpartisan issue, right? Like, we passed this bill in 2001 under Governor Perry, a Republican. And there's a reason that this has been a nonpartisan issue, right? Because as you mentioned, it's not just helpful for a student and his or her family, but for all of us. So, Priscilla, you did work this session on explainers and resources, and you also testified. Talk a little bit about the history of Texas's DREAM Act and why it has had such bipartisan support for the last 25 years almost.
Yeah, of course. So I think context is Texas was also the very first state to pass in-state tuition for undocumented students. So Texas does have this ability to be leading in very positive ways on the frontier of immigration policy. The Texas DREAM Act was passed 24 years ago with, like you said, really bipartisan support because they recognize that this is not just a humanitarian issue. This is a workforce issue. This is an economic issue. When every child in Texas has the opportunity to learn and grow and contribute, regardless of where they're born, we all prosper when that happens. And the DREAM Act is not just about access to public education, and it's not just a policy, but it's a priority that we're making to Texans and to our future. Like you said, this passed under Governor Rick Perry. And even when Governor Perry was running for president, they asked him about this on the debate stage, and they were like, why did you pass this into law? And he said something along the lines of, these children came here, this was not their decision to make. And if you do not support them on their way to success, you have no heart. And I think we really need to get back to that. A lot of these children did not make the decision to come here, but they're still here. They're dedicated to making Texas their homes and to making our state more prosperous. And so that's why we've been having such success with undocumented students here in Texas graduating from Texas colleges and universities. They saw that their state invested in them, and now they're giving back. We're seeing that these undocumented students are becoming lawyers, are in the medical field, are teachers, and these really critical labor forces that where we're seeing gaps and where we need more people, we need more qualified workers coming into this field. And so that's what some of the history of what the Texas DREAM Act has done. And this has been successfully in place, like I said, for 24 years. And I'll let Krystal and Gaby get into more of the technical nuances of what the fight was like at the legislature. But there were so many people that came out in support of our Texas Dreamers. We had, obviously, again, the usual suspects of the immigrant rights advocates. We were there, but there was also so many educators there, so many students that were there and testifying in support of their friends who were Dreamers. We had the business sector come out and testify like, no, we need these workers. We need them here. We had folks from religious groups really also come out and say, this is part of our faith, that we are giving people these opportunities that they need and want.
And I was going to say, Gaby, talk about your experience coming to Texas, being at the legislature in that room. Just kind of describe for our listeners, like it was a packed room. Talk a little bit about that experience and kind of what you told lawmakers.
So one thing that I think it's really important to note is that Texas led the way in 2001. And actually, Californians like to fight and say, no, we were first, but they actually were second. It happened at the same year. But one of the interesting things about this is that every 2 years we see, right, somebody introduced the legislation and they always have failed every single year. This year was no different. And they have failed exactly because of what Priscilla was saying. The amount of people that come out to support and the amount of data we're able to show how this is a net positive to the state of Texas really has always dampened on anybody's illogical desire to remove the policy that has shown to be successful and has worked. And it was no different that day. And we learned about this. I don't know if you remember this, that this was going to happen on Friday. And so I had a decision to make on Saturday. Do I book a flight, a last minute flight, which we know it's really expensive, to go out to Austin to testify? And the answer was easy. Yes, I'm going to be there. We had written already what was going to be our written testimony we were going to be submitting. But throughout the years, it has become harder and harder for individuals and people to use their voice. And so we were trying to figure out, because you have to bring in copies for everyone, you have to submit it in person. And so I say all this to say that in my time, right, as a person that has been doing advocacy in this work, the connection between the state legislatures, Florida, Texas, you name it, Congress, right, and its people, it's starting to become more difficult for individuals to use their voice. And I say this because to me, it was such a heartbreak to know that we had won in the state legislature, that so many people, as you mentioned, Kristin, came out and we sat there for hours and hours and hours listening to other debates, which were actually some of them a little bit interesting to say the least, but connected because they were so worried about dropout rates and making sure that people were graduating from high school. Yes, there are institutions that right now at this moment, a few of them in Texas that are really difficult to get into, but majority of institutions in Texas are in desperate need for students and enrollment. And so what was interesting to see there is how many people came out and how many people stayed until late at night to use their voice. And like Priscilla mentioned, and you mentioned too, Kristin, the voices of those who were supportive of this were the majority, right? I would say probably like 80% to maybe 20%. And I don't know if I shared this with all of you, but after I testified, I stepped out and I saw two of the people that had testified against the Texas Dream Act. And I approached them and I tried talking to them, and they wouldn't even look at me in the eye. And I extended my hand and I said, look, I'm a former dreamer. I just want to answer your questions. I'm not going to assume that you're doing this out of malice. You're doing this out of concern. And I said, I just want to answer your questions. And it was just so interesting to me. They didn't even want to talk to me. And as awful as that interaction was, the people that were there, the business leaders, as Priscilla said, the church leaders, the students, we have been trying, right, to get through people's minds that what we hear around this debate is not true, right? That this idea that immigrants don't want to get legal, that's not true. That these young people should have come the right way. Please explain to me what right way a 4-year-old comes into the United States. And if that is really the concern that people have, right, then okay, let's help when they turn 18 and are adults, adjust their status, right, or do something. For me, it was really interesting. And I just want to say that I think beyond the conversation that we're having today of the Texas Dream Act and what a detriment it is that the Department of Justice went against what the people of Texas wanted, what the legislature decided, which was we are not going to repeal this. They just didn't have neither the votes nor the desire nor the support from the community to do it, that the government went against that desire of the people of Texas and did it in essence colluding with the attorney general and the governor. I just also wanted to mention that the support was there. Yes, there was minimal opposition, but their opposition made no sense.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Gaby, because thanks to your efforts and all of the advocates' efforts, this bill died. There was not the will to pass this bill. because Texans know that this is not just an income generator for our state, but it's also the right thing to do. And I think that's what you probably saw when trying to confront the lawmakers who wouldn't even make eye contact or respond to you, because they know you don't do that to young people. You don't do that to students and take their dreams away after being almost lifelong residents here in Texas, growing up with their children, going to school with their children, being in the same community. How do you look somebody in the eye and say, I'm going to take your dream away for a political soundbite? And you talked about how it was really a very backdoor, undemocratic collusion that happened once our state realized that there was no will to repeal the DREAM Act. Krystal, can you tell the listeners exactly what happened and why currently we don't have the DREAM Act, even though the repeal bill died? What happened there?
Yeah, so this echoes SB8 in some ways. I had an inkling at the time that there was greater powers that be that wanted something to pass, that it seemed like everyone understood that the Texas DREAM Act was good policy. And so what I was told was, can you help us figure out a way of writing this that doesn't impact anything? Like, can we redraft this bill so it does nothing, but we can pass something? So I knew that there was pressure happening somewhere from somebody that wasn't the committee members, wasn't the author, to make this happen, to have something passed that said it repealed the DREAM Act, but maybe didn't necessarily affect policy. Not even that passed, right? They couldn't even get the political will or get the votes together to do a do nothing bill. And so these bills die. So one thing to note is that in the Senate, the bill that was introduced by Senator Middleton, who is running for Attorney General, and on the Senate committee is Senator Paxton, who is married to our current Attorney General. So these all just to have, in mind. So the bill's passed out of the Senate committee and then died in calendars, never passed out of the House committee. And then within a few days after Sonny died, legislature closes out, we get notified that there's been a lawsuit filed, that the DOJ has filed suit against Texas for their DREAM Act, saying that it violates federal code. And within 6 hours, a settlement was entered into, signed by our Attorney General, saying that they were not going to enforce the DREAM Act when it came to undocumented students any longer. And like Gaby said, this really smells of collusion, because 6 hours is not sufficient time for anyone to have gotten notice of the suit, for people who are impacted to be able to intervene and have their voice heard in front of a court. And they also really cherry picked the district and the judge that this case was going to go in front of. This was not accidental that they ended up in, where is it? It's Wichita Falls, right? It's not accidental that they ended up in front of this particular judge in Wichita Falls and entered into this agreement so fast that nobody could get their voice heard and kind of go over the heads of lawmakers and the people of Texas.
Just another instance of the federal government overreaching, getting into our state, telling us what we should do, what our immigration policy should be, what our education policy should be, regardless of what the people want, regardless of what our businesses want, regardless of our economy. Gaby, I want to link on our podcast to some of your amazing materials. Y'all have put out such good data and materials on this specific issue. But at the end of the day, if this repeal is held up, there's currently litigation that's been filed, but lots of confusion about what this means for incoming students. As you mentioned, Gaby, about these schools, many of these schools depend on student enrollment. And so what does that look like when all of a sudden thousands or tens of thousands of students are not going to be present in the fall and going on into the future? And I know, Priscilla, we were on a meeting talking with a group of advocates about some of the concerns, but How does that play out for Texas? What does this mean?
That's a really great question. What does this mean for Texas? What does this mean for currently enrolled dreamers in our universities and colleges? The unfortunate thing is we don't know. The coordinating board hasn't really released any guidance on what is going to be happening to the students that are currently enrolled. We're trying to determine, will they be grandfathered in, or do they have to reaffirmatively reach out to admissions and let them know about their status, or somebody in the main office of their university to make a redetermination? Because usually the way this works is the dreamers will submit their affidavit that if and when they're eligible to adjust their status, they will, right? But after that, the university doesn't follow up. And so that means that universities would have to make an entirely new system to, one, identify these students again, and then follow up with them to see what measures are being done, if not, and adjusting that in that way. So the real unfortunate thing is we don't know right now. And this lawsuit was filed and entered into a settlement within 6 hours on June 4th, right in time for summer sessions that are starting for summer school at these colleges and universities. So we couldn't see implementation even then because it was far too soon and there was no guidance issued. And now we're just waiting to see what ends up happening for the fall semester. But I also think a really important, I'll be quick about this, is that when this lawsuit was filed, and then again within 6 hours when the settlement came in, we saw advocacy groups coming in together to ask Attorney General Ken Paxton to defend the DREAM Act. There was a press release that sent out a broad coalition of folks. That's almost 100 different organizations that signed on to this letter and asked them to defend the DREAM Act. Because again, the will of the people in the legislature really came and shone through. And unfortunately, we just didn't see that from our Attorney General.
And Gaby, what have you heard from students that you all support in Texas? What are they saying and what have you heard?
They're distraught. They're confused. There's so much anxiety because the colleges don't know what's happening either. And so they're going to their institutions, and the institutions that are putting their hands up saying, we don't know what's happening. So there's complete chaos. And there's a couple of things that I want to say. One, Kristin, you talked about the federal government. And I think, Texas, out of all the states in the United States, feel really particular about not having anyone else come and tell them what to do. And their academic freedom, right? This is about academic freedom, telling Texas how to educate, what to do, right? That's one thing that's happening there. But I think it's also really important, and I want to say just some numbers, because I think back to what you were saying, it's really important to put some of the data of how it's going to affect. So the Dream.us has graduated over 400 scholars in Texas. Among them, 25% of them are working in education. Many of them are teachers. There's some school principals. 23% of them are in business and entrepreneurship positions. 17% of them are working in STEM, so science, math, tech, and 14% of them are in health and medicine fields. These are young people and folks that are everyday Texans are being touched by. Either they're teaching their students, they're the ones drawing your blood, they're the ones providing a service to you, you're eating out of their restaurant, right? So this is really important for people to understand and grasp. But the other thing that I wanted to share is the loss of earning and economic activity. So according to the American Immigration Council, when in-state tuition goes away, the cost of not having undocumented students is going to be $461 million per year. This includes $244.4 million in lost wages and earnings and $216.9 million in decreased spending power annually. And then the return of investment, undocumented students with some college education create an additional $46.4 million in economic activity in Texas every year. So this is what Texas is going to start losing by not having undocumented students be able to go to college. And not to mention what the institutions are going to lose, because here's the misconception that people have. And I've heard Senator Middleton and others say this, but it's unfair because these students are paying in-state tuition versus somebody that comes from Oklahoma and has to pay out-of-state tuition. Well, first of all, the student that lives in Oklahoma Their family does not live in Texas. They're not paying any taxes. They're not paying property taxes. They're not paying any sort of taxes and contributing to the economy of Texas. Those Texan students who have graduated from high school have been contributing to Texas. We also know that the legislation, what is said is that they needed to have minimally been there 3 years and graduate from a Texas high school. So we know they're Texans. And so the other thing is that these institutions are going to get $0 because there's no tuition if they're not going to school. So there's going to be millions of lost of revenue for these institutions. We already know, and we probably don't want to get into all this stuff, right? But international students are under attack, and a lot of the institutions depend on international students. So what are we doing to our higher education system? And if we're thinking, well, this is going to help me, my child, who's a US citizen, I was born in Texas, I'm 3-4 generations ago. Guess what? It's going to affect your child because your child's class, the one that could have been open, there's not going to be enough students, so they're going to close that class available for them. The institutions are going to have to fire professors, and probably the best of the best professors, because those are the most expensive ones, because they just cannot afford it and they don't have the revenue. So this is going to impact everyone.
I'm so glad, Gabby, that you raised all of the kind of ripple effects that this is going to cause. And similar to what we kind of talked about with Senate Bill 8 and Senate Bill 17, I don't think Texans are prepared to have these types of policy and legal changes affect themselves. They think, oh, it's just going to impact somebody else, somebody I don't know. But I'm so glad you brought that all up because this impacts all of us in a negative way. And I think it's going to be a situation where, again, you don't know what you've got until it's gone. And so, again, it's going to be a situation where Texans will regret this. And to wrap up and in closing, is there anything that our listeners can be doing now if they're concerned about this and concerned about how this is going to impact them? I want to close it with asking Priscilla, Krystal, Gabby, what do you suggest for our listeners?
Yeah. So the media and even politicians will use whatever polls, whatever is convenient for them to be able to share out, and they're not true. I just saw that President Trump has posted just messages and polls and stuff saying that the American people and the American public want mass deportations, and that is not true. The same goes for this. A lot of people are going to believe what the attorney general, what the governor, what these leaders who have big megaphones and mics are telling us, when those things simply are not true. And so it is up to us, right, the people that are listening to this podcast, to rectify the record and use their voice to say, that is not how I think. That is not what I believe is best. And even though this has already passed, we know, as Krystal said, many of these folks have political ambitions. They want to go beyond being a state senator, state representative. And so you might say, well, who cares? Me reaching out to them right now, it's not no longer in session. Why should I even use my voice? No, it matters. And I have seen how people are listening and kind of telling how many people call. I had a friend who told me this recently, and she said, the people that care the most win. Even if it's just 2 people, that is enough to make whatever they believe, make it seem what it's supposed to be for everyone. So are we the ones that are going to care more? Or they're the ones, the minority, the really, really small minority of people, they care enough to be loud and be loud constantly. That's how we should be. Loud, we should be calling people, we should be talking about this, we should be posting about this on social media, get it to our own little circles of folks and friends, and spread it like it's the new best thing out there. Information spreads fast. And unfortunately, right now, misinformation spreads faster than wildfires.
Yeah. That's such great advice, Gaby.
I can go first, Krystal. Yeah, I think what can people do now? I want to reiterate what Gaby said is talk to people. A lot of people don't know what's going on, but if they did, they would be outraged. And we need to channel that outrage into something. So talk to your mom and have her talk to her priest. And have him get involved, right? I think we're so much stronger when we show up in community. And I think we saw that this legislative session, that we cannot allow this litigation just to stop us and be like, well, it's happening. There's nothing else we can do. There's always something that we can do here. And I think one, showing support to our dreamers is the first and foremost thing that we can do, that we support them. Maybe you're not a dreamer, but you can be making demands of your university to be doing more, right? To be protecting your students, to be protecting your students' information, to make sure that if this does apply to them, that they're not going to be sharing this information with federal immigration enforcement. There's so many different things that we can do here in the interim, even while this litigation and lawsuit plays out. So I just want to say that it sounds silly, but do that and follow us on social media. We know that there's going to be news that's going to be coming out as this litigation is unfolding, and we're going to be covering it. So follow TXILC, follow thedream.us. And if you want to support these dreamers, you can also donate for scholarships for dreamers. So go to thedream.us and they have an option for just Texas students. So support our Texas dreamers. And I'll pass it off to Krystal.
Yeah, so I'm not going to reiterate what Priscilla and Gaby said because they covered it so well when it comes to in-state tuition policy work. I think what I want to focus on, or what I'd like to highlight, is also just the danger of what we saw with the executive branch, both at our Texas level and at the federal level, overturning the will of the people. And what happened, like, creating legislation is supposed to be bipartisan. It's supposed to be coming together with all the best brains and asking people for their expert opinions and coming up with good policy proposals. I think we need to keep an eye out and really reject the idea that the way that we did the sue and settle agreement, where they basically asked to be sued so that they could stop doing the DREAM Act because they didn't get their way during the legislative session. I think we need to all keep an eye out and make it very clear that that's not okay, that we have a separation of powers for a reason. And we're not supposed to be using our courts like that, or using the executive branch to overturn the will of the people, the voters, the representatives who are supposed to be there making good policy, because they have the tools, they've enlisted the experts, they've had the hearings, they've listened to the testimony. I'm a little bit concerned that this is going to become the new way that the executive branch in Texas gets their way when things don't go the way that they wanted it to be, that they ask this friendly administration, because it's friendly right now, to sue them so that they can enter into these sue and settle agreements. And so I think making it very clear that that's not something Texans want, and that we believe in our separation of powers and lawmaking needs to be left to our lawmakers, is also a very important message to get to your representatives and to the governor.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great place to end. I wanted to thank you, Krystal, and you, Priscilla, and special thanks to you, Gaby, for all of your amazing advocacy, tireless work. And it really has been such a pleasure to get to know you over this session. And I always say, but it's only because of all of these bad policies that we end up meeting amazing people and forming broad coalitions. So that is the only silver lining I would say to any of this, is that we have these new coalitions to do exactly what you were just talking about, Krystal, is to really bring the power back to the people and advocate against this kind of executive overreach that we're seeing at state and federal level. So thank you all so much. Gaby, please keep in touch with us and we'll talk soon.
Great. Thank you so much. And we couldn't have won in the state legislature without all of you. So thank you for leading the way.
Aw, thank you, Gaby. Keep in touch.